Bloomberg Audio Studios.
Podcasts, radio, news.
In just 2 weeks, the 33rd Olympics will get underway in Paris. And for the first time in history, the Summer Games won't kick off in a stadium, but instead on a river, the Seine. And that's not the only thing that will be different about this year's Olympic Games.
I think what's at stake is nothing less than the credibility of the IOC.
Hugo Miller is a reporter with Bloomberg who's been covering the run-up to the Games. He says the reason that Paris has become such a high-stakes event for the International Olympic Committee, or IOC, has to do with the history of the Games and their history of blowing the budget.
From really the origins of the Games, when they were first the modern incarnation of the Olympics, it was very much about prestige. It was very much about pomp and circumstance. What that led to over time was a very bloated form of Games. There was no sense of not doing things. It was always about doing things and more. When in doubt, add another ceremony or whatever it might be.
But a series of Olympics marred by terrorism and cost overruns in the 1970s called that strategy into question.
It began with the terrible tragedy of the murder of 11 Israeli athletes in Munich in 1972.
So shame on you, International Olympic Committee, because you have forsaken the 11 members of your Olympic family.
Then in 1976, you had an absolute fiscal disaster that beset Montreal. Then you had the Winter Olympics, which were scheduled to be held that year in Denver, before the taxpayers revolted and said, no thanks.
Innsbruck, Austria eventually agreed to host the Winter Olympics in 1976. But more crises followed. The 1980 Summer Olympics in Moscow were boycotted by 65 countries, including the United States, due to the Soviet Union's war in Afghanistan.
The final outcome will say more about the state of East-West relations than about international sport. It certainly looks as if the Olympic spirit is going to have to struggle to survive.
By 1984, very few cities were clamoring to host the Games.
You had a whopping 2 bidders. You had Los Angeles and Tehran. But that bid quickly became very complicated when a revolution overtook the country. So essentially, the IOC was left with a single bidder, and that was Mr. Peter Ueberroth and his bid in LA.
Peter Ueberroth was a star water polo athlete in college who dreamt of one day becoming an Olympian. But he couldn't quite make it as an athlete, and instead founded a successful travel agency. His background as a successful business person meant he had a different vision for how the Olympics should be run.
He said, listen, I essentially think we need to run a modern, no-nonsense Games. We're going to house athletes in student dormitories. We're not going to build any stadia. We're going to use the existing Rose Bowl and the LA Coliseum. And we're going to do this, and we're going to do this on budget, on time, the way I want to do it. And essentially, the IOC had no choice because that was the only bid going.
So on July 28, 1984,
assembled before you are the finest athletes in the world.
Then President Ronald Reagan opened the 23rd Olympic Games in Los Angeles.
I declare open the Olympic Games of Los Angeles.
The ceremony featured 84 grand pianos being played by 84 Liberace lookalikes.
So it certainly had glitz. It certainly had a kind of Hollywood-style sizzle. But what it didn't have is a sense of sort of unlimited budgets.
The Games were the first to include the women's marathon, rhythmic gymnastics, and synchronized swimming as events. And they were also the first to ever turn a profit, meaning Ueberroth did eventually achieve his dream of making Olympics history.
He famously was the first, and I think to this day, only Olympic Games architect that managed to deliver a sizable profit of some $250 million.
Today on the show, why Paris is trying to follow in LA's footsteps, and what a pared-down, cost-conscious Olympics could mean for the future of the greatest show on Earth. I'm Sarah Holder, and this is The Big Take from Bloomberg News. To understand just how hard it is to run a profitable Olympic Games, It first helps to understand how the games make money, says Bloomberg reporter Hugo Miller.
The games are paid for with a very carefully determined budget, which is made up essentially of revenues from sponsorship, from what's called the top sponsorship. It's the Olympic Partnership Program. Right now, they include Alibaba, Airbnb, Bridgestone Tires, Coca-Cola, Intel, to name just a few. And they will contribute what is currently thought to be between $2.5 to $3 billion for an Olympic cycle. And that would be a 4-year period.
But that's not the only source of revenue.
There's also revenue coming from TV rights.
Though that could be changing as viewer habits change. Already, TikTok announced a sponsorship agreement with the British Olympics team, which brings us to a third source of revenue, funding from the private sector.
And the challenge I think every organizer has is to maximize the contributions from the private sector and minimize the amount of simple donations or funding from state coffers.
The aim is to make sure that it's not cities themselves that are actually paying for the cost of the games. But that's been hard to achieve.
There is a difference between what is spent on the games and what is spent on the infrastructure of the games. And that's where the Olympics have got into trouble.
Hugo says that even though Peter Ueberroth's 1984 LA Olympics offered a roadmap for how to run a profitable games, like, for instance, by using stadiums that already existed, for many years, organizers just didn't heed those lessons. Take the Athens Olympic Games in 2004, which cost over $10 billion.
There are some people that even say that the sovereign debt crisis that befell the EU 10 years ago, which began in Greece, began with the Olympics.
Then there was Sochi in 2014. In those games, the Russian government spent over $50 billion. And then the 2016 Rio Games, which became known for building white elephants, stadiums for events that went unused after the games.
There were famously photos of the Olympic swimming pools filled with just sort of green mold in the water 6 months after the games.
Terrifying.
Yeah.
These cost overruns and abandoned projects made it harder and harder for cities to convince their residents that hosting the Olympics was all it was cracked up to be.
There are a number of cities where the citizens have ultimately decided that, no thank you, we don't want to host the games. This was true of Rome, this was true of Boston, this was true of Oslo, Norway. In fact, the Winter Olympics for 2022 that were just held in Beijing, there was only 2 bidders. There was Beijing and Almaty, because the other bidders that were essentially all in Europe had all said, no thank you.
The IOC decided something had to be done. So they changed everything, including how cities even raise their hand to host the Olympics.
So rather than having a beauty pageant where the IOC delegates visit cities, and then there was a grand opening of an envelope a year later, and the winner is announced and all the others go home and cry into their beers, you have a very different system where you have countries saying, hey, I'm interested. And the IOC says, okay, what are you thinking? And then there's a series of conversations that are held privately, which some people might say, well, that's not a very transparent process. But what it does allow is it allows the IOC to be much blunter and say, I think this is a nice idea, but you're not ready.
Hugo says this has meant that fewer cities are even submitting bids. But that's fine as far as the IOC is concerned, since the bids it is getting are now more likely to be realistic. Which brings us to Paris.
The IOC is definitely hoping that Paris 2024 will work, will come off as a shining example of a new, streamlined, more socially, more fiscally, more environmentally responsible Olympics.
Coming up after the break, Paris's plan to make the Olympics more sustainable and whether it will work. The Paris Olympics' organizing committee has said that its $4.7 billion budget will be 96% financed by the private sector. Government officials have said that the Games will be the most economical in decades. Bloomberg's Hugo Miller says they have taken notable steps to make sure those statements are more than just talk.
Paris is not spending large amounts on new stadia. It's using, in fact, an old stadium used to host the World Cup as their main athletics venue. They are stressing the construction of temporary facilities. They're even going to be holding beach volleyball beneath the Eiffel Tower using temporary grandstands, bleachers. So in essence, they're trying to capitalize on the existing infrastructure and existing beauty of a city like Paris. And that, they hope, is going to keep costs down.
But there's always the possibility that something could happen to derail even the best laid plans.
I think the big wild card in the Paris scenario is the security aspect. We just don't know what could be happening, or what could happen over the course of the next 3 weeks to 4 weeks in Paris. And either a single event could send costs skyrocketing as suddenly, literally, thousands of additional security need to be brought in.
But even with that asterisk, Hugo says that the Paris organizers have been getting high marks for their cost consciousness.
In terms of the operational costs that have been planned out, even cynics seem to be saying that Paris is doing a good job of their planning.
The hope is that if these games do come in on budget, it could serve as a blueprint for subsequent Olympics.
What begins in Paris is an unprecedented run of 6 Olympics being held in very pretty cityscapes, naturally stunning scenery, whether you're talking the Alps for the Winter Olympics or the likes of Paris or an LA or even a Brisbane on the Australian coast.
But if history is any guide, getting the strategy to stick could prove tricky. After LA's 1984 success, cities only managed to learn half of Uberoth's lesson. They emulated the Hollywood sizzle and forgot all about the cost-taming strategies. Plus, Hugo says that it's not just about economics when it comes to the Olympic Games. And that could lead the Games to be hosted in some places that don't exactly scream budget.
I think the chance that the IOC wants to take riskier bets with the Games is very high after 2032. And probably the country that is most discreetly but aggressively bidding to host the Olympics and even a Winter Olympics is, believe it or not, Saudi Arabia. So, as crazy as it sounds, it may be the case that Saudi Arabia bids for and wins the rights to a Winter Games in the 2030s to come.
Why not just have one place host the Olympics every year? Why even compete and have to build all these new stadiums every year to win the Games?
That's a very sensible idea. The idea of having one single host, people say Athens, it was the historic host of the Olympics. So why not Athens? And then why not a sensible, fiscally prudent country like Norway host the Winter Games where there's guaranteed snow? I think that's not going to happen because the IOC believes that it wants to bring the Olympic spirit around the world. They very much believe in that as their mission. So that particularly does mean countries with younger demographics, not just sort of aging Europe and aging North America, but to Africa and to Asia and to South America. So although it makes perfect sense from a financial point of view, from a sustainability point of view, I just don't think it's going to happen because the IOC really believes in this mission of theirs.
Right, I guess the Olympics isn't ultimately only about financial prudence. It's about having the world come together for this event.
We forget that, but it's supposed to be about a 2-week festival of sporting excellence.
So, Hugo, are you going to the Olympics this year? What sport are you most excited to watch there?
Indeed, I am. I hope I can get out of the city for at least an afternoon to catch the biking, particularly the mountain biking. But if not, hopefully I will catch some of the road racing through the scenic streets of Paris.
That's it for this episode of The Big Take from Bloomberg News. I'm Sarah Holder. This episode was produced by David Fox. It was edited by Tom O'Sullivan. It was mixed by Blake Maples. It was fact-checked by Jessica Beck. Our senior producers are Naomi Shavin and Kim Gittleson, who also edited this episode. Our senior editor is Elizabeth Ponso. Nicole Beamsterboer is our executive producer. Sage Bauman is Bloomberg's head of podcasts. If you like this episode, make sure to subscribe and review The Big Take wherever you listen to podcasts. It helps people find the show. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back on Monday.